evening, everyone. Welcome to Steinway & Sons. My name is Gordon McNally. I'm the manager here. Hi, Steve. I didn't see you before. I'm the manager here at Steinway & Sons, a gallery here in Melville. How many have never been here before anything? Wow, you've drawn a larger crowd every time. Well, welcome. I am sure you're going to certainly enjoy the program that Carol has prepared for you and the students have prepared for you this evening. This edition of the Composer's Landscape, as we all know, is focusing on Felix Mendelssohn with the little treat of Fanny Mendelssohn that Carol's certainly going to talk about as well. So I hope you certainly enjoy it. If you have any questions, I would not be doing my job if I didn't say and remind you that we sell pianos. So if you have any questions about pianos at all, by all means let me know. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have. But at this time, I would certainly like to turn the program. Oh, before I do, I always forget. If you haven't already done so, please turn off your cell phones or pagers. Does anybody have pagers anymore? But please, either set them to vibrate or turn them off so that they don't disrupt the program. At this point, I would certainly like to turn the program over to Steinway artist Carol.
Hi, everybody. I love Felix Mendelssohn, and I've often thought that he was underappreciated. So I think this evening will be an appreciation of Felix Mendelssohn and Fanny. That was the little surprise that I mentioned in the flyer. This is like 2 years late for the bicentennial celebration of his birth. Mendelssohn was born in 1809. In fact, it's very interesting that several, or quite a number, actually, of the great Romantic composers were born between 1809 and 1811. Mendelssohn, Chopin, Schumann, Liszt. I think Tchaikovsky might have been around there, too. Mendelssohn died in 1827 at the premature age of 38. George Bernard Shaw said that if you want to find out how good a pianist's technique is, ask them to play 10 bars of Mozart or Mendelssohn. And I think what he meant, because he did think of himself as a music critic, although I mostly don't agree with his opinions in his essays. Mendelssohn's music requires a certain clarity and a certain refinement. It's unruffled and discreet and pure and harmonious and very balanced. Missing is the impetuosity of a Schumann, but Mendelssohn could write impassioned music, as he did, for example, in his quartet in F minor when his beloved sister Fanny died. He was not narcissistic, and unlike Schumann, he wasn't interested in all that self-reflection and self-revelation in his music. In fact, you would be more likely to find out more about Felix from his letters to his family. And even though he uttered that famous phrase about music saying it about feelings and thoughts much more clearly and effectively than words could ever do, Mendelssohn's letters, he could write very articulately in words, and his letters were masterpieces to his family from wherever he traveled. They were not only beautiful descriptions of places that he visited, but in the margins he had these beautiful little watercolors. He was a wonderful watercolorist, and he had snippets of musical ideas that came to him. For example, when he was traveling in England and in Ireland and the Hebrides, when the theme of the Hebrides Overture came to him, he jotted it down in the margin of a letter to his family. And they're quite beautiful to see. But even in his music, it could be said that Mendelssohn was an observer and a painter in tones rather than an analyzer. Now, some people find this reductive, and Mendelssohn has been criticized that he simply made tone poems. But in Mendelssohn's case, I think he used the landscape as a metaphor for his inner landscape. And for example, the mysteries of the Hebrides Isles and the Fingal's Cave are full of mystery, and the open joy of the Scottish and Italian symphonies and the playfulness of his Midsummer Night's Dream overture, all of those were facets of his personality and his inner self. He was an enormously gifted person. I mentioned the watercolors, and he could speak and read and write in 5 languages, and he was attracted to literary works, as were Schumann and Schubert. Hence the Shakespeare thing. Somebody once quipped that Mendelssohn's music was wasted on such a silly play. He was not overly sentimental or self-indulgent. In fact, in his very short life, he had a very deep ethic of hard work, which was fostered by his both parents. And even though he could live quite comfortably because the family were wealthy, he was never complacent, and he never had a struggle to make a living, but he worked very, very, very hard. A bit of bio, I think, is needed here. Felix Mendelssohn was born into this very distinguished Jewish family, which is mentionable only because it presented such an obstacle to his whole family. There is an actual town record book of his very distinguished grandfather, Moses Mendelssohn. At age 14, hunched back and really deformed, the impoverished son of a scribe, trying to enter Berlin after walking 80 miles from a small town, being turned away from one gate and being told to come in through the servants' gate to the city of Berlin. And the little jotting in the town record says 6 oxen, 7 swine, and 1 Jew. And that young man turned out to be one of Europe's greatest philosophers and scholars of the Enlightenment period. And Moses was ultimately designated a Schutzjude, which means he was a protected Jew, which spared the family some of the humiliations, but not to the extent that Fanny and Felix didn't grow up with stones being thrown at them in the streets and had to ask the question of their parents, is it shameful to be a Jew? And years after his death, Richard Wagner wrote that the life and works of Felix Mendelssohn clearly demonstrated, quote, that no Jew, however gifted, cultured, and honorable, was capable of creating art that moved the heart and soul. And years later, Wagner urged the German government to oust every single Jew, offering the massacres in Russia as an example worthy of imitation. And some 50 years later, the Nazis destroyed the very beautiful Mendelssohn monument in Leipzig, hacking it to pieces. But in spite of this unbelievable handicap of having to endure and surmount rampant anti-Semitism, Felix and Fanny were able to grow up in an atmosphere of high culture. Felix's mother, Leah, was so scholarly she could read Homer in the original Greek, and she played the piano very well, and she had so many accomplishments, and their beautiful home that their father, Abraham, was able to purchase because he created a successful business, attracted the greatest musicians, poets, artists, and thinkers of the age. Of course, Abraham had to convert the family to Lutheranism for them to be allowed to stay in their home in Berlin, adding the name Bartholdy, which you often see Mendelssohn Bartholdy. But Mendelssohn eventually took the prerogative of eliminating that appendage from his name because he rose to such a respectable level a respected level all over Europe, that he flourished in spite of it. It's very interesting to note that most music historians consider that Mendelssohn was by far, and I'm not blaspheming when I say this, the more gifted child prodigy than was Mozart. By 16, Mendelssohn had written some of his best work, the Octet for Strings, the Mendelssohn Piano Concerto, the Midsummer Night's Dream Overture, and large-scale structures with ease and inherent grace, whereas Mozart's early work is really not memorable. And the other difference is that Mozart's father helped Mozart's childhood composing and tinkered with it, whereas Mendelssohn's father was not a musician, and it was all his own work. Young Felix was taken to see the great poet Goethe, who took Felix under his wing and relished every visit of the family, and relished Fanny's gifts too, his sister's gifts. Mendelssohn referred to the poet as the imperial son of my life. One time it is described, a certain visit to Goethe from Felix, and maybe Fanny was there that time. The poet had heard the 7-year-old Mozart at age 7, 60 years earlier. And here was Felix. He handed him a Mozart manuscript, and here was the young Felix as a child playing Mozart to him. And then he handed him another manuscript. This was all blottings and scratchings out all over the place, hard to read, because he thought he could really challenge Felix and probably dupe him. Felix tried the music, and he stopped and he said, "This is Beethoven. I should know it anywhere." But Goethe did not admire or understand Beethoven. He thought he was a wild man. And during one visit, Mendelssohn played the first movement of the Fifth Symphony to Goethe on the piano several times until Goethe had to acquiesce and had to admit that Beethoven was a very great composer. And just imagine hearing 50 or 60 men play that together in an orchestra. So that was a big achievement. And I did mention that Fanny pleased the poet very much herself too, with performances by memory of 24 preludes and fugues from the first book of Bach, Well-Tempered Clavier, from memory. Mendelssohn is often mischaracterized as having had only bliss and no struggle because the family didn't have to struggle financially. But that's a mischaracterization. He really did have down periods. He was, on the whole, what we might refer to as an ecstatic, responding to the world on a very high-pitched frequency of gratitude and gladness, which you do hear in his music. And his piano music is distinguished by its light, capricious character, almost evoking the kingdom of Oberon that he described musically in his Midsummer Night's Dream. And this is a quality we should hear as well in the Rondo Capriccioso, which will be played later this evening. But his music is much more than playful and happy, which I hope you'll hear in the Variations Sérieuses. Mendelssohn did basically have a sunny disposition, but as I mentioned, he had his down periods, especially when his operas, a series of operas, were not well received in Berlin and in Leipzig. He was very depressed about that. He was mostly being recognized as a pianist and for his scholarship in unearthing the great choral works of Johann Sebastian Bach, which had lain dormant, fallow, for 100 years, which is kind of amazing to think about, until he brought them and, performed them with choral societies. Mendelssohn could also fly into a rage at the conservatory in Leipzig, where he taught piano, when people were careless about the scores and had irreverence for the composer or didn't produce enough sonority in their playing. He was a tough teacher. Mendelssohn and Schumann were both deeply affected by Beethoven and Bach. One of Mendelssohn's shortcomings might be said to have been that his music was perhaps too well balanced. He rounded off the length of phrases, and he kept things nice and tidy and resolved and happy and clear, whereas in Beethoven there are uneven phrase lengths, and the unresolved nature of his music provided unrest and tension and passion. Schumann, in that respect, was much more close to Beethoven than Mendelssohn. And from Bach, Mendelssohn drew the habit of having recitatives in lots of his music, in his sonatas. But in all of Mendelssohn, he had his own unique, deeply expressive voice, even if it is less complex and more amiable. They're not bad words. When composers borrow ideas from other composers, they usually just weave it in their music, and you either notice or think you notice something that was borrowed. But when Mendelssohn did that, he was inspired by another composer or used the germ of an idea. He turned it into almost an anthem and a great tribute and an homage to the source. And there are many places in Mendelssohn where it's very obviously Beethoven, and he wears it as a badge of homage to Beethoven. Mendelssohn's favorite place to be was home with his family, especially in Leipzig. He did not like Berlin. He would almost rather have been any other place but Berlin. And he traveled extensively and widely and all over Europe. And when Mendelssohn went to England, which became like his second home, he was accepted and celebrated like a prince. In fact, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert had him in their palace every time he visited, from his younger years into his, well, you can't say his later years. He never had later years. And he played for them for hours. And when he traveled in Italy and in Switzerland, he did some of his most beautiful watercolors. I have a wonderful book. It's called On Wings of Song. It's a big fat tome of a biography, which I read every word of these past weeks. And it has beautiful color plates of his watercolors. And they have a very light and airy touch, very analogous to the touch that's required in playing his piano music. In fact, that's one of the greatest challenges of playing Mendelssohn, the touch. His scherzo effects, so scherzo means joke or playful, as in the Rondo Capriccioso and the octet and lots of some of the variations, have a very airy, light staccato, bouncy movement, usually in the higher registers. And the pianist has to strive for evenness and a refinement and clarity while keeping an unerring pulse. This is all a question of balance and control. What do I mean by balance and control? Well, in this music, for example, there are millions of notes. And the first reality is that they're not all created equal. They're made up of phrases, and there's a beginning of a phrase and an end of a phrase, and there's a contour in the middle, and relative importance of the notes that are in between, and nuanced dynamic contrasts, all of which these pianos that we're lucky to play on in this gallery, and I am at home, you can do as well as any instrument. I should mention how much fun it is to play this beautiful instrument. But still, it's different from the Steinway that I have at home. And that's another one of the challenges, because each piano is regulated and voiced in a different way. And this music is so delicate that is really a big challenge. And another challenge is that rubato, which means robbing time and a fluidity of the tempo, has to be kept to a minimum, because it's essential to remember that the Romantic composers, like Schumann and Brahms and Liszt and Mendelssohn, were very, very punctilious about writing their indications about fluctuations in the tempo where they wanted it in the music. And they use words such as espressivo and stretto and sostenuto and ritenuto and allargando and all of those words, approaching it from different philosophical angles. So I'm always telling my students that first of all you have to keep your own impulses down to a minimum because there's enough fluctuations that the composers wrote into the Romantic works. And it's important to know the exact Italian meanings because, for example, if you want the music to slow down, just in the variazione that I'm going to play, there are 4 different indications. One is ritenuto. Tenuto means hold. Hold back. That's different from ritardando, which means slow down, which is different from allargando, which means broaden, which is also a form of slowing down. Largo means wide, which is different from calando, which means die out. So that implies not only tonally but rhythmically. And Mendelssohn understood the hand very, very well on the piano, and those patterns and the intricate passages have to be practiced very slowly with very rational fingering before you can take them up to tempo and take them out on the road. Otherwise, it amounts to what I like to call typing. Mendelssohn hated virtuosic playing for its own sake. He wrote, "These piano acrobats give me less pleasure than rope dancers or circus acrobats. They do not endanger their lives, but they endanger our ears." And the best way to practice technique is with the musical meaning behind every gesture. It's my best and my only advice, because the music gives the clue to how you handle every challenge that's in the music. When Felix's sister Fanny died, his own health began to decline. It's one of the great mysteries in musical history. Insidiously and mysteriously, as though their 2 souls had been connected with currents between their brains. And just several months later, Felix died at 38 from the same kind of brain condition that had killed his sister and his father and his grandfather. And they never really write a definite diagnosis, but it was similar to a stroke. But very strange, the life kind of went out of him when Fanny died. He loved his sister so much that many people thought he could never really love another woman as dearly as he loved his sister. But he did marry and love his family, his wife and his children, and did watercolors of them. And he was very happy to be at home with them. But his soulmate was, musically speaking, was always Fanny. And when the news of his death reached England, Queen Victoria wrote this in her journal. "We were horrified, astounded, distressed to read in the papers of the death of Mendelssohn, the greatest musical genius since Mozart, and the most amiable man. He was quite worshipped by those who knew him intimately, and we have so much appreciated and admired his wonderfully beautiful compositions. We liked and esteemed the excellent man, looked up to and revered his wonderful genius and the great mind, which I fear were too much for the frail and delicate body. With it all, he was so modest and simple." So now I am going to play the Variazione Seria, and I'm just going to say 1 or 2 words about 1 or 2 words. That's not possible for me, but I'll tell you some basic stuff. In 1841, that's 6 years before he died, Mendelssohn wrote an excited letter to a friend. "Can you guess what I've just been composing, and passionately? Variations for piano. 18 of them on a theme in D minor, and I had such enormous fun writing them." He chose a humble, plaintive tune. He even called the tune peevish, and he embroidered it in a serious, sober way, building on it with every conceivable novel idea. Each variation is so different from the one that came before, and one of the challenges is that you have to change your apparatus radically for each variation. You have to do different things for each one. He called it sérieuse because most of the sets of variations were written for virtuosic reasons, but of course there was already the Goldberg variations by Bach and the Diabelli and Eroica variations by Beethoven. The Chopin La Ci de Rem variations are slightly frivolous, and there were great variations to come after his, which were inspired by Mendelssohn's. Anyway, that's about it. 18 variations held together in an organic whole because the piece is so perfectly well balanced and beautifully crafted. It all holds together. And I think that this piece demonstrates all the facets of Mendelssohn's character. Excuse me. word about the songs without words. There are 48 of them, and they're quite varied. And they're probably the pieces that have been performed most frequently in salons all over Europe. When Mendelssohn was asked what he meant by writing wordless songs, he replied, excuse me, "A song is just as it stands. Even if I had a particular word or words in mind, I would not want to tell anyone because the same word means different things to different people. And only the song says the same thing and arouses the same feeling in everyone, a feeling that cannot be expressed in words." Some people like to criticize the songs without words and call them slight because they're miniatures. But nobody ever says that they're insignificant. And some are very strikingly original. I mean, the albums consist of barcarolles and spinning songs, and folk songs and hunting songs and so on. And they're like miniature tone poems. And of course he wrote the huge tone poems. And the philosophic question, I should tell you that Brahms said, "I would gladly give all I have written to have composed something like the Hebrides Overture by Mendelssohn," which is quite something coming from Brahms, who is revered all over the place, whereas Mendelssohn has had lots of criticism. The philosophic question that is often asked is, can we be content with simple beauty and sheer happiness with no conflict or puzzles? Some people feel that Mendelssohn charms the listener and doesn't astonish. For my part, I think there's a perfect place in this chaotic world for simple beauty and sheer happiness. Edward Latari is one of my students, and he's a wonderful musician. And thus far, I have not invited any of my own students to participate for obvious reasons. They all know what I have to say, and they prepared it with me. Edward actually jokingly asked me whether I wanted him to purposely make some mistakes so I would have fodder for criticism, and I told him that there was always something we could find to talk about. So please welcome Edward Latari. Okay. You played it beautifully, and there's hardly anything I want to tell you. But I saved some stuff that I didn't tell you at your lessons, so that I remember something. Okay, so starting with this spinning song, so-called spinning song, which in some editions, you know, Mendelssohn didn't write all the titles that appear in his albums with songs without words. Sometimes, in some editions, this is called the Bee's Wedding. English edition, so you could hear, you know, you could hear that it could very likely be that. Okay, there are a couple of phrases in this, and I know what a light, fabulous touch you have and can have, and actually, I think you could do it even lighter in certain of these, which I'm trusting that I can show you. For example, this, you know, there's such a sheer beauty in that. And another one here. All of those. So I think that you could do these descending little, there's another one somewhere. And the last phrase, you can just disappear and wisp off into Never, Never Land. Okay, why don't you try those three passages? Try this one for now. Even lighter, Edward. Pedal the whole thing. Pedal the whole thing. Even though we didn't talk about that. It's very sheer to do that. And more pinky. Right, isn't there another one somewhere? Anyway, try this last passage too, and wisp off into nothing at the end. And now do it with the corner on, so it's even softer. Beautiful. Did you notice on your program that the first song that he played was a duet of two voices? I meant to mention that before. And you did grade, you set them beautifully against each other. Start the piece again, maybe a little bit softer, so that the crest in the middle, where it comes organ-like in the middle of it. Okay, so maybe a little bit. With more E flat. It was doing it with more E flat. I would have liked this, similar to the end of the other one, to fade off into. You know, we talked about it, and it's really not in my fingers, but this. You know, just fading off at the end. So do from there, because it wasn't soft enough yet. Very beautiful. All right, thanks, Edward. The next pianist is a student of Donald Perrone at Queens College, and she will be playing the Rondo Capriccioso, which is really one of the masterpieces that he contributed to the piano literature. Are you, Dora, are you there? Dora Galit?
capriccio parts of that. It's a lovely, you have a lovely way of doing that, a beautiful touch, just exactly what's required for this piece, and playing beautifully. There are certain melodic notes that I'd just like to suggest that you bring out. And one of the things, if you would, that I didn't quite agree, I agreed with a huge majority of your musical ideas in this piece. And I admire what you did with it, but I just have one or two little suggestions. The main one being the beginning of the piece. You played these chords very, very forte. I don't know if you know that you did that, but this G sharp is one of the most beautiful things in the piece. The beginning, the top notes of those chords, and the bass line is so beautiful. I don't think the character is really robust in the beginning, and you did it quite full. It says pianissimo, so I would try to play the top voice. The left hand there, and when this comes in, because there's so much fast playing in the other part, I wouldn't rush through this. And then it gets bigger. But could you try the beginning?
I was told that from a few people that I played too slow.
Too slow?
Yeah. It can be slower.
It wasn't your tempo that I mind. I mean, you could play, look, you could have the same effect and do it and still be gentle. That's up to you. But this, even if you do it faster like I'm doing now, it's much more songful, so try it. More G sharp by far. Make that fourth finger longer than the rest of your fingers so that when you play the chord, that finger sticks deeper into the key bed. Okay. I still think it's too big in scale. Can you do it even tender or even more piano? I mean, just try it. You may not end up doing it that way when you perform it, but try it. Try the unicorda there. Okay, start again with the unicorda. That's it. That's the quality, the atmosphere. Beautiful. Watch this G sharp. May I suggest something there? I wouldn't use my pinky on that note. Because the pinky is the least fleshy of our fingers and the least secure and the most precarious. When you're doing this, I'm using my fourth finger. Try your fourth finger there. Beautiful. Each finger has a different quality to continue. notes out. Deeper. Right. Okay, and this was bliss. What you did was bliss here. Now, okay, so then you finish all of this capriccio part that you can do as well as anybody, and then you're winding down. Now, you did this rather fast. And your arpeggios were wonderful, but I didn't think the melody, which Mendelssohn marks marcato, which he really wants it to sing out. So would you mind doing this part? Okay, over here, may I? Okay. This was exactly right over there, but now here. You're burying them a little bit. And maybe no pedal, so that the chords could be a little shorter. If you're going to pedal, maybe a speck of pedal on the half bar. The top of and coming there. So do. Again, you're using your pinky, honey, and he even writes for. It's just a much more secure finger, right? Very, very nice. That's excellent. When you come to this, you're not doing the sforzandos and the pinkies there. You're doing. I don't hear the note picked out that he wants. Try to get those pins, and then there's no choice. You have to have your pinky thing. Try it again. Your balance is a little bit off there. If you lean towards the top, and just put. My teacher once said to me something so funny. He said, sometimes you finger a phrase, sometimes you hand a phrase, and sometimes you arm a phrase. So when you're playing, that's your arms, okay? And if you're doing a bop, that's your fingers. And this is your little muscles of your feet. But this is your hand. If you just play the pinky and just rotate your hand over the rest, you're handing those passages. Deep, deep. Very little is going on. If you flail your fingers there, it's a different thing, but. Try that. I think in this place there should be a big contrast between the frisky, because he writes tranquilo, and that's one of the words that implies a shift in tempo that I spoke about, a fluctuation. So you're doing, this is all tempo. And then, all your frisky stuff again. You want to try to make more of a contrast then? Deeper tone. With your fourth finger. Oh wow, do you feel the difference of the tone you get with the fourth finger than when you use your pinky? So do that again. Delete them. And you haven't practiced it with that set of fingers, you know, and you're such a good sport to try it. You really want to, okay. So, okay, do this and then come into here. Don't bumpy. See, I think over there also, because of so much airy gossamer wings, kind of fairies dancing around, but and again the top voice a little bit more. Really, really beautiful. Over here, when you're doing voice again, you write it espressivo. That doesn't only mean expressive. It actually implies a sostenuto, a lingering. So just from here, the top voice too. And wherever you can not use your pinky, that would be better. Poor pinky. It gets all the most important notes because the singing lines are on the top of your hand and it's the weakest finger. But wherever you can, use your fourth finger. grateful to Patrick Haight and to Gary Field for recording these wonderful workshops. I mean, they're not wonderful because I do it, but just to remember all of the playing that we are listening to these wonderful young people. I just want to say a few words about Fanny Mendelssohn, a little bit more than what I said before. I think she's best introduced, and her plight is best introduced in a letter that her father wrote her. Music will perhaps become Felix's profession, whilst for you, it can and must only be an ornament, never the root of your being and doing. He feels a vocation for it, whilst it does you credit that you've always shown yourself good and sensible in these matters. Remain true to these sentiments and to this line of conduct. They are feminine, and what is truly feminine is an ornament to your sex. Anyway, as I mentioned before, Felix and Fanny were soulmates, and whenever she composed, and many people think her music was just as beautiful as the music that he composed. And they bounced it off of each other. And yet, when Fanny asked Felix once if he would try to have his publisher publish her music, he refused. He refused his beloved sister, saying weakly that if she managed to get them published by herself, he would support her. Now, much of this had to do with conventions and propriety. The ironic truth is, had Fanny been poor, she would have been quite well known, because she was as good a pianist as Felix. She composed beautiful music, and Clara and Robert were poor. And Clara had to go out and earn a living, while Robert stayed home and tried to compose, and Brahms babysat their children. But Fanny didn't have to, and therefore it was not seemly, it was not becoming for a woman in her station to go out and earn money making music or having her stuff published. But there's one adorable tale about Felix and Fanny, who were Felix was alone with Queen Victoria and Prince Albert in London in their palace, and he was playing to them, and he asked Queen Victoria whether, because she was a wonderful singer, whether she would sing one of his songs. And she said she'd be glad to, and she leafed through her music and she chose one of Fanny's songs. And he accompanied the Queen, and he said, as a matter of fact, you chose one of my sister's songs. Would you do me the honor now of choosing one of my songs? So now we're going to hear two movements from Fanny's sonata in G minor, and they're played by my friend Victoria Griswold. And after she plays, one of the things that I've regretted about these workshops is that we haven't had a forum, and I really would like you to participate by listening to the music of Fanny, and let's just have a little discussion about what, if any, differences we can discern. They were very close, they bounced their music off of each other, they were affected by each other, but I assure you there are differences. So let's just welcome my friend Vicki Griswold.
Thank you. I'd like to say a couple of words about this sonata. It was written 4 years before Fanny died. It was never published during her lifetime. It is in 4 movements. The movements are continuous, but I'm just going to play the first 2 and kind of improvise a cadence for the second movement so that we can, won't go over time. Fanny wrote over 400 compositions. Most of them were not published during her lifetime. Many of them have never been published, but it's only within the last maybe 20 years that people have started taking an interest. There's several, at least 2 recordings out there of this piece. She wrote 2 other sonatas, but this is the biggest. And that's all I can think of to say right now. Oh, except that this is published by a company called Hildegard Publishing, and they only publish women's music. They've done a wonderful job of bringing this music out so that it's accessible to people. It is a little pricey. You don't exactly have to take out a second mortgage to afford it, but it's great that it's out there. So here are the first 2 movements of the sonata in G minor by Fanny Mendelssohn.
I really don't know that sonata, and I have not heard it. I actually downloaded it to listen to it before. And I really don't, for my part, see that much relationship between the music that you just played and the music that I know composed by Felix. How do you feel about that?
Well, this is a larger work, and of course, Felix, with the exception of maybe the variations that he is, didn't write sort of larger works.
Well, he wrote sonatas for cello and piano, and he
Yes,
wrote some
it's
piano
chamber music.
sonatas. He wrote,
Did he?
yes, he did.
Okay.
But still, you know what I'm thinking is that in many ways, I mean, I've never deigned to say whose music was greater, because they're so different. But I have a feeling that her music is more unexpected and original in harmonic progressions, and I think I have an idea why. Haydn was a highly original composer in his day because he lived outside of Vienna at the court of the Esterházys, and he wasn't affected by what was being composed around him, whether it was Mozart or Beethoven or all the other classical composers. And so he had his own unique systems and sounds in his head because he was in an enclosure, in a compound of the Esterházy. Fanny was having to stay at home with her family and her children. And what she did to save her soul musically was she became one of the most highly prized salonières. She had salons in her house where most of the finest musicians and poets, and maybe because she was so cut off from the publishing and the active, outside world, she managed to have this freshness in her style. I'd love to have any of your commentary also, if you heard anything that you wanted to comment on as far as the difference. Yeah, Sherman.
What struck me about Fanny's sonata was probably because of her use of a minor mode, a kind of Jewish or Eastern quality to it, and somewhat different from the typical German, the trend from Haydn and Mozart and so on.
That's very interesting. I heard that too, especially in the second movement.
Well, yeah, B minor, and then B major is the tremolo kind of fairy tale type of.
Does it, yes, Gary.
I thought she was very experimental tonally. I mean, almost Chopin-like in being experimental with keys and key relationships. And I don't know whether it's because it's a sonata as opposed to a shorter piece, but the lines are very long.
Yes, that's right. And not such an even number of bars
Yeah, it's not
per
so-
phrase,
yeah, it's
not
not
so
so set.
tidy.
Not so classical.
Yes,
I found the first movement to be, forgive me, but Beethoven-esque, and the second movement, as you said, more like Chopin. And I don't find that as much with Felix, but it's very interesting to hear.
that is interesting.
I wouldn't have guessed that it was written by a woman.
Or a Mendelssohn.
Or a Mendelssohn, as a matter of fact,
Right.
yes.
She did
Well,
write.
what do you mean by that, Julie? What does written by a woman mean?
Yeah, but that is my first impression, because there was a great prejudice in those days and even today, that women are secondary creatures and they are just ornaments or whatever. And I didn't.
I find it a very passionate work. I think that sort of
Yes.
shares with Beethoven. But she did write a number of songs without words,
Yes.
and they sound very similar to
Oh, do
Felix.
they?
Yeah, they're practically identical. They're, it's very beautiful, but
Well,
not
you
so.
played it beautifully, Vicki, and I
I
just
love
think
that.
that was beautiful. So we're gonna let Felix have the last word. And I'll just play one of my favorite songs without words to end the program, which will be my last workshop. I had planned to do a Rachmaninoff in 2 months and a French composer's one after that. But I have a few other projects and a few other things going on, and it's a lot of work to put together each one of these. So, not saying that in future I might not take it up again, and I hope you'll watch for, you know, announcements from the Steinway people. And I really do thank you so much for coming to these and supporting the work we're doing. It's really a wonderful feeling, and I've loved every bit of it.